This move immediately claims central space and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for many common and dynamic opening systems. This move, 1, e5, immediately challenges white's central pawn and aims to establish symmetrical control over the crucial d4 and e4 squares, leading to many classical opening variations where both sides vie for space and development. This move, nf3, logically develops a knight towards the center, attacking black's e5 pawn and preparing for kingside castling, setting the stage for a symmetrical opening or a variety of classical responses. This move develops a piece toward the center, controls key squares, and prepares for central pawn advances, maintaining symmetry with white's last move and entering a very common and well-established opening framework. This move initiates the Lopez, a highly respected opening that immediately contests black's knight and prepares to develop the bishop to a more active square, potentially putting pressure on black's central pawn structure. This move, the Morphy defense, challenges white's bishop and forces a decision, often leading to pawn structure changes and a positional battle. This captures the knight, creating an unfavorable doubled pawn structure for black and opening the d-file for white's queen. Black's dx-c6 move breaks the pawn symmetry, creating an isolated pawn on c6 which may become a target later in the game, but also opens the d-file for the queen and gives black more central pawn presence. This move develops a piece towards the center and prepares to castle, while also reinforcing the pawn on e4 and creating attacking potential on the queenside if black's doubled c-pawns become a weakness. Developing the bishop to c5 activates the piece, eyeing the f2 pawn and preparing for kingside castling, while also influencing the central squares. This move solidifies the center, prepares for kingside castling, and opens a diagonal for the queen. This move develops the bishop actively and prepares to challenge white's central control by potentially pinning the knight or forcing exchanges that can equalize black's pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, supporting the knight on c3 and eyeing the queenside where black's pawn structure is somewhat compromised. This exchange on e3, while simplifying the position, grants white the bishop pair and a slightly more harmonious pawn structure. This pawn move creates an isolated doubled pawn on the e-file but opens the f-file for potential rook activity and improves the central pawn presence. This move develops the queen, centralizes it, and connects the rooks, preparing for castling and improving overall coordination. This castling move secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, centralizing their activity and improving the overall piece coordination after the structural compromises of the doubled c-pawns. The move *000* signals an immediate intention to create a dynamic kingside attack by castling queenside, directly challenging white's center and potentially leading to opposite side castling pawn storms. This move reroutes the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to support a kingside pawn advance or to coordinate with the rooks on the open c-file. This knight move aims to reposition the piece to a more active square on the kingside, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing to attack the opponent's castled king. This move aims to reposition the rook to a more active file, potentially targeting black's central pawn structure or preparing to support a queenside pawn advance. This move aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances, although it weakens the dark squares around the king. This move 12, b4 initiates a pawn storm on the queenside, aiming to gain space and potentially create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. while also preparing to advance the queenside pawns further. This move repositions the knight to a potentially stronger square on f7, preparing to contest the e5 pawn and support a kingside pawn advance or a regrouping maneuver. This move initiates a flank pawn advance, aiming to gain space on the queenside and potentially exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Should black respond with b5, black eliminates white's important light-squared bishop, weakening white's kingside pawn structure and aiming to develop attacking chances with the open f-file. This recapture opens the f-file for your rook, creating attacking potential on the kingside and a central pawn majority. This move aims to secure the queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn expansion with c5, while also considering the long-term safety of the king given white's active rook on the f-file. This pawn push aims to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially create an outpost for white's pieces on c4 or d4. This pawn exchange on b5 opens the c-file for black's rook and offers an opportunity to challenge white's pawn chain on the queenside, though it also concedes a central pawn majority to white. This move decisively opens the a-file for white's rook, creating immediate attacking pressure on black's queenside and aiming to exploit the pawn structure imbalance. This move aims to solidify the queenside pawn structure and prevent white from expanding further with b6, while also creating potential counterplay on the queenside. This knight maneuver aims to exploit the weakness on c7 by potentially forking the king and rook, while also creating a strong outpost that challenges black's queenside pawn structure. This move aims to disrupt white's central pawn majority by activating the queen and preparing to challenge the b5 pawn, creating counterplay on the queenside. This move seizes central space and prepares to control the d-file, aiming to restrict black's knight and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. The knight's advance to g5 aims to challenge white's control of the central dark squares and potentially initiate an attack on the weakened kingside after white's pawn structure has been compromised. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, potentially supporting a future advance or defending key squares, while preparing to challenge black's advanced pawns. The knight repositions to a more active square, targeting white's advanced pawns and preparing to support black's central ambitions. The move 20, qc3 aims to exploit the open c-file and put pressure on black's queenside pawns, preparing to potentially advance the b-pawn further or support a central breakthrough. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the d-file, aiming to create counterplay by doubling rooks or supporting a pawn push to c5. This move centralizes the rook, supporting the d-pawn and preparing to contest the open d-file, aiming to exploit black's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move aims to improve the king's safety by moving it from the vulnerable c7 square, which is exposed to potential attacks along the c-file and diagonals from white's pieces. This central pawn push exploits black's uncastled king by opening lines and creating potential pawn breaks to challenge the queenside majority. This move repositions the queen to support the central pawn advance and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. This move develops the rook to a more active file, aiming to control the central c-file and prepare for potential pawn advances or exchanges. This move challenges white's central pawn structure and opens the d-file, creating dynamic possibilities for both sides as the game transitions into a middle game fight. This move opens the e-file, challenging black's central control and preparing to activate white's rooks for an assault on the queenside or a central push, while also freeing the light-squared bishop. The knight ventures to f4, challenging white's bishop on e3 and aiming to control the critical d5 square while potentially exploiting weaknesses in white's pawn structure, especially after the recent pawn exchanges. This move aims to exploit black's weakened queenside pawn structure by opening lines for your pieces and creating threats against the d6 pawn. This move liquidates the central tension, offering white a potentially isolated d-pawn but clearing the d-file for future action and relieving black of a strong knight outpost. This exchange opens the e-file and creates an isolated d-pawn for black, which will likely become a target as white's pieces aim to control the weakened central squares. The move recaptures a central pawn, opening up lines for both sides and potentially leading to further exchanges in the center. This move forces the black king to a more exposed square, creating immediate tactical threats and potentially weakening black's central pawn structure in preparation for white's next attacking thrusts. This move concedes the c-file and prepares to bring the rook into play on the open file, but it allows white's king to escape further checks and consolidate. This move is a decisive tactical blow that exploits white's kingside pawn structure weaknesses, forcing the exchange of the last major piece and leading to a favorable endgame for black. This move recaptures the pawn and centralizes the queen, aiming to consolidate material equality and prepare for the upcoming fight in the endgame. This move establishes a powerful passed pawn on d5, aiming to disrupt black's kingside pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's major pieces. The move black plays is 29, re8, which aims to connect the rooks and challenge the central pawn structure while preparing to defend against white's advancing passed pawn. This move creates a dangerous passed pawn on d6, restricting black's pieces and forcing them into defensive positions. This capture on d6 opens the c-file for your rook, creating dangerous attacking chances against white's king, but it also concedes the d-file, potentially allowing white's pawn to advance. This move activates the queen to exploit the open c-file and pressure black's king position, aiming to create mating threats.